Here we go. So for the next few weeks going forward, the look will be we are going to spend 1 week on the US dealing with stuff internationally, and the following week dealing with whatever happens at the same time period domestically. So domestically means at home. So today we are going to go from 1945, so basically the end of World War II, where we left off last time, up through the end of the Eisenhower administration in 1960. This is America at sort of its apex. Is on the home front. Next week we'll talk about how our economy is booming. Here we are going to talk about how America flexes its muscles and drives the world towards what our presidents and our secretaries of state envision as the future for America. So let's get rolling here. The people pictured up here are, for your purposes, you need to know, here's President Harry Truman, and here is Secretary of State George Marshall. Last time we saw George Marshall, he was commanding all of the U.S. forces from Washington, D.C. George Marshall is a personal favorite of mine in U.S. history because he is maybe the greatest civil servant in American history. He works his way up through the military as Secretary of State, and by the time this chapter is over, he will not only have been the Secretary of State, he will have also been a Secretary of Defense. Never really seeking out personal aggrandizement, always there for the good of the country. So we'll talk about him. We will talk about President Eisenhower here. We will talk about USSR or Russian Premier Nikita Khrushchev right here. We will talk about atomic bombs. That'll also be what your other assignment's on this week. And we will talk about the Korean War. Without further ado, the Cold War. So we started the Cold War last time. We had kind of established that at Yalta and later at Potsdam, the U.S. under Franklin Roosevelt had sort of given the Russians a blank check to do whatever the heck they wanted in Eastern Europe, which we established was a mistake. So this is going to deal with the fallout from that is really going to dictate the next 50, 60 years of American history. And also sort of explain why Vladimir Putin's in charge of Russia now. But anyway, let's get rolling. So this starts off in 1946. A guy named George Kennan, he is one of the heads of the embassy in Moscow. So where our employees of the State Department work out of Moscow in Russia, George Kennan is our expert there. He is the most well-regarded and most intelligent guy working for the U.S. government, sort of examining the way Russia works. He's been there for part of World War II. He's very understanding of what the Russians are doing and is attempting in this letter to explain to the rest of the State Department and then the United States in general what exactly Russia's goals are. So he lays this out in what's called the long telegram. It's something like 8,000 words long. He dictates the entire thing, but basically he says that Russia is not to be trusted. The USSR is not to be trusted. Joseph Stalin, who runs the USSR, is paranoid, and he believes that the West, so kind of those NATO powers that we talked about last time, so US, France, UK, Denmark, the Netherlands, West Germany later on, Turkey later on, Greece later on, those countries are always going to be out to get, quote unquote, the communists that he's in control of, and he will do anything that he possibly can to damage those Western allies, those capitalist nations. And so Kennan is saying, hey, you need to be prepared for this, and we need to get ready to stand up to the Russians, because the only thing that Joseph Stalin understands is more strength. So we need to be able to show strength, and we need to constantly keep an eye out for Russian meddling in international affairs. And this is really, and this is not an exaggeration, going to lay out the basis for United States foreign policy for decades to come. Following this up, the next year, in 1947, we are going to pass what is called the National Security Act. Prior to this, we had a Department of the Navy, we had a Department of the Army, and that was just confusing. So the National Security Act, enacted in the Truman presidency, is going to create the Department of Defense. So anything that is going to fight or defend for the United States is all going to be put under one executive agency, the Department of Defense, which still exists today. And it's also going to create the CIA. So the CIA had been around in sort of embryonic form all throughout World War II. It had never really had clear guidelines as to who they answered to or what exactly they were doing, but the CIA is going to be created as America's spy agency. This is going to allow us to send people overseas, both overtly and covertly. So overtly means we're being honest. Hey, this person is, looking to get information from you. If you want to come and talk to them, that'd be great. And covertly means as spies, is that we're hiding. So America is ready to gather information and then fight in the Cold War should it become hot. We're going to call it a Cold War because, with a couple of rather large exceptions that we'll discuss over the next couple of weeks, Russia and America never actually go to war against each other. One country will fight against what is called a proxy of another country. So when we talk about the Korean War in a little bit, the Russians are not going to fight us directly during the Korean War. Instead, they are going to arm the North Koreans who will fight against us. And by doing this, we are able to avoid going directly to war with the other major superpower. So within a couple years of World War II ending, the Americans and Russia will both be considered superpowers. America is a superpower right away, whereas the Russians are going to take a couple years to get there, but they will definitely be a superpower as well. The first big place that this is going to sort of pop up is the fate of Germany. As we discussed last time, Germany is going to be partitioned. It's going to be split in parts. So West Germany is about the western 2/3 of the country, and it is largely industrial to try to welcome them back into the larger European community without much really going on. I mean, there's stories about Nazi war profiteers that survive and become multi-billionaires afterwards, but that's not really our business. Take AP or if you want to talk about that stuff. But the other side of this is that the Russians are going to control the eastern third of the country, which is pretty poor. So the Russians get not a great deal out of that, but hey, the Russians, too bad for them. The problem here is that Berlin, the capital of Germany, is located in that eastern third. And that city will also be partitioned, as we'll talk about in a second. The thing that West Germany kind of stands for, along with Austria, is these are basically the only two countries that were taken by the Russians that come back to the sort of democratic capitalist fold. Countries that are going to act like the US going forward, whereas anybody else east of Germany and Austria is going to be forced to become a communist country under the Russian yoke. So Truman sees this and he sees, oh boy, that's not good. We need to stop the spread of communism. And so his first step here is what is called the Truman Doctrine. And that says the US will do anything to stop the spread of communism, especially with money and technology. So think of this as sort of like Lend-Lease all over again. Is America, again, is going to offer you money or goods for cheap to keep you from going to the communists. This is going to be expanded. And this is the way more important one. It's good to know the Truman Doctrine. You must know the Marshall Plan. The Marshall Plan, instituted by Secretary of State George Marshall, remember we talked about him earlier, he is now going to say, we're going to pump billions of dollars. Right now, it's about $1.2 trillion worth of money into Europe. All you need to do is apply to get this money, and the US will just give it to you. And then you can use that money to rebuild your industry, rebuild your cities, get your economy back and rolling. Because, as Marshall sees it, if the economy in Europe gets up and gets moving again, communism is way less attractive. If you have stuff, you don't want to give it away, and you can get stuff if you take this US money. It's very successful in the long term. Like on paper, if you read a lot about the Marshall Plan, it doesn't look that successful, but it is able to convince a whole lot of Europe to not go communist. Let me demonstrate. The nations in yellow ask for money from the Marshall Plan. As you can see, these are all countries that we've talked about, Turkey, Greece, later on Italy, that are going to end up joining NATO. So we are essentially giving these countries money, and by doing that, we are ensuring that they're going to stay relatively free. They're going to have free elections. They are going to have a free market, so they will stay capitalist. You buy goods instead of having goods given to you by the government. The only two countries that are going to fail in their application are going to be Switzerland and Spain. Spain because it is a fascist dictatorship, and Switzerland because they didn't really fight in the war, and they're also hiding a bunch of Nazi gold. The two countries that are going to pull back their applications are both countries in, as you can see, this purple sphere of influence, which is Russian. So the Russian countries do not apply. They are given the option to apply, and Marshall basically does this to say, hey, A, maybe we can combat the Russians here economically, but B, we can also show all these people in Yugoslavia, Bulgaria, Romania, Hungary, East Germany, Poland, Czechoslovakia, Finland, that the Russians aren't looking out for your best interest. The USSR is not looking out for you. It's looking to eat you up and make you part of a larger communist country. And by not allowing those countries to apply for the Marshall Plan, he drives that fact home. But the Marshall Plan is going to be very, very successful in that regard. The Russians are going to get so mad at us, actually, that they are going to force upon us what is called the Berlin Airlift. The Berlin Airlift goes on for about 11 months until like about April 1949. And what happens is because Berlin is in the western part, Berlin's right about here, is in the eastern part of Germany. The only way to get supplies to the Allied districts, so the French-controlled, the US-controlled, and the British-controlled districts of Berlin, is to drive about 100 miles with supplies through communist East Germany to drop them off. And Stalin says, hey, I'm going to do a power move here. And that's what this cartoon is referring to. And he is going to cut off all rail and road access to Berlin and basically try to starve the Allies into leaving Berlin. The Allies realize this is what he's trying to do, and instead, the US, with the help of the French and the British, are going to send in everything by air. This is a massive, massive undertaking. So they're going to fly in over 300,000 flights over 11 months, drop off over 2.3 million tons of supplies. So this is everything from coal to bread to candy, whatever. And they do this to basically show that Stalin doesn't have power here. Even though he's cut off the road, we can still fly into the three airports that are in West Berlin, the main one being called Tempelhof. You can still go see it. Here, U.S. planes flying in, dropping off stuff to the kids. And it's incredibly successful. This is the same thing that we saw with the Arsenal of Democracy, is that America is not going to be pushed around by other countries. We have the manufacturing might, and we have the talent to make all these planes, get all these supplies, and then fly them in over enemy territory, drop them off, and turn around again. At its height, the Berlin Airlift is landing one plane every 30 seconds for days at a time. It's nuts. And if Stalin were to ever shoot down one of those planes, it would be an act of war, and the rest of the world would look at Russia and basically say, what are you doing? They're flying humanitarian flights. You look terrible here. So Stalin realizes that he's lost, and like it says here, he backs off. So America, thanks to the smarts of President Truman and Secretary of State Marshall, are able to sort of use money and supplies to become the good guys at the beginning of the Cold War. So that's our first one. Next, what happens with the fear that communists will continue to expand? What does that look like? Truman is going to say that the game plan here is to use a strategy that he calls containment, and it's exactly what it sounds like. You want to contain the communists. So going along with that Truman doctrine, where, hey, you need money and supplies, ask us for it, we'll give it to you, you can't allow communism to expand. So what Truman is going to try to do to stop this perceived communist expansion throughout the world is use brinksmanship, which is basically say, hey, we're going to send in the military, or maybe we'll just nuke you if you don't back off. It's called brinksmanship. It could also be called very aggressive bluffing, but that is the basic idea behind it, is Truman's foreign policy is going to be back off or we'll shoot. Please don't make us shoot. Also, remember what happened when Japan pushed us too far. We dropped that second bomb on Nagasaki. We're willing to do it again. This is going to be backed up economically. This is your big one. Like the Marshall Plan was the biggest thing we talked about on that last slide. This is your biggest one here, is NSC 68 in the arms race. This is a picture of the cover of NSC 68 right here. NSC 68 says that, that stands for National Security Council, and this is the 68th document they issued, says that the U.S. is going to commit to spending at least 20% of all the money it makes every year, gross domestic product, hopefully you remember that from freshman year, on defense spending. which means we are going to need to beef up our army again. Our army following World War II, remember, was largely demobilized. We sent most people home, assuming that nuclear weapons would keep everybody in check. As we're going to see, that's not the case. So NSC 68 is going to commit to spending a massive amount of US money on defense. So that's nukes, that's soldiers, that's better technology, that's better planes, you name it. We will not be outspent by the USSR. The USSR is now another superpower. We have to keep pace with them. And that is going to lead to the term called the arms race, which, as I said a little while ago, is going to be the other thing that you're going to be working on this week, is taking a look at some numbers on the arms race and doing a little writing on that. The arms race is essentially the term for the US and the USSR creating more and creating better nuclear weapons and nuclear delivery technology. So that could be missiles, that could be torpedoes, that could be, sometimes they tried a nuclear bazooka, that's a real thing. That's planes, that's how the planes get there, how we communicate with those planes. Any way for nuclear weapons to be issued is going to be part of the arms race. It's incredibly expensive. But if we don't compete and keep pace with the Russians, it looks like either we are weak or we have failed. And America can't abide doing that, so we're going to continue to spend more money. As we're going to see going forward, and I'm going to keep pointing this out, this arms race is eventually what is going to win America the Cold War with Ronald Reagan by the late 80s, is America's economy is going to keep chugging along pretty well. Russia's economy will eventually flag, and they're going to start spending money that they don't have. America is also going to begin regularly testing nuclear weapons at the Bikini Atoll in the Pacific. That is where the term comes from. It's not like there were women out there wearing bikinis at the time. Bikinis are actually due to a cloth shortage during World War II. That's where you get your two-piece bathing suits. And then they're jokingly named bikinis after that because it's always in the news. That's also where the name Bikini Bottom from SpongeBob comes from. That's why you have a bunch of mutated monsters living at the bottom of the sea. Get it? American servicemen are exposed during these tests and other tests later on, develop cancer, and are studied by the U.S., all without the U.S. really admitting to having done this. We don't fully cop to it until the Clinton administration in like 1994. Spies. It is not just nukes and threatening to nuke people. It's also trying to figure out what sort of nukes the other side has. So the US and the USSR are going to step up espionage attempts in an attempt to gain information on their rivals' nuclear technology in this arms race. Remember at Los Alamos, there were spies there, as we will talk about with Julius and Ethel Rosenberg in a second. The KGB is going to send spies into the US. The CIA is going to recruit spies in Russia. You tend to only hear about the spies that fail. There are very successful US spies that we recruit, but we're not going to go into that. So the first two big spies are Julius and Ethel Rosenberg. They are caught spying. They are caught because actually Ethel's brother is a Russian spy, is caught, and he flips on them. Julius had worked at Los Alamos, as had David, his brother-in-law, and he got a 10-year prison sentence in exchange for flipping on Julius and Ethel, who claimed they'd never done anything wrong. They probably did something wrong. They did not do as much as was claimed, and they are eventually executed by the electric chair after President Eisenhower refuses to grant them a pardon. So they are spies that are executed by the US for spying for the Russians. The other big one here, and remember this name because it'll lead us into our next chapter next week, is a guy named Alger Hiss. Alger Hiss worked for the State Department under the Truman administration, and he admits under oath that he had been a member of the Communist Party. He's outed by another communist and is actually one of the people that kind of goes after him is future Vice President and then future President Richard Nixon. The big thing for our purposes here is that Alger Hiss shows that the State Department had at some point in time been penetrated by communist spies. And all of a sudden America's like, whoa, wait a minute. There are communist spies working for the Russian government in America. If we only know about a couple of these, that must mean there's a bunch more we don't know about. And America's going to start getting very twitchy about Russian spies entering the US. And this will lead us to the Red Scare, which we'll talk about next week. Lastly, I just wanted to point out that Israel was founded in 1948. Originally, there was an attempt at a two-state solution where Jews would have one state and Palestinian Arabs would have another state. The Palestinian Arabs basically said, nope, we want it all or nothing. And so the United Nations and the US said, fine, you get nothing. And they founded Israel. Israel will be largely populated by Jews who have survived the Holocaust and from other parts of the world. They're going to come in there, and they're going to be the Western allies' big ally in the Middle East. The Russians had really been gunning to take over the Middle East, and the US largely is going to find a great ally in Israel that will exist to today. And it also gives us a foothold in the Middle East to sort of fight back against perceived communists that are in the Middle East. Now, the big event for Harry Truman's presidency is the Korean War. This map is up here because not everybody knows where Korea is. So Korea is this peninsula right here. It used to be one country, but after World War II and after the Japanese are driven out of Korea, the country is split in half right here on what is called the 38th parallel. So let's go over this. The country is split into Northern Korea, which is the one that borders China and Russia, is going to be basically given to communist control under a guy named Kim Il-sung. He claims that he was magically born on a mountain and rode a unicorn before he was born. There's all sorts of crazy stuff because North Korea essentially becomes a communist cult. Whereas South Korea, also called the ROK, which stands for Republic of Korea. North Korea's DPRK stands for Democratic People's Republic of Korea, which is a lie. It's a dictatorship. But the South is theoretically democratic. It's not really. It's more of like a dictatorship run by a dictator that has a bunch of really strong U.S. ties. But they're going to be backed by the United Nations. They are viewed as the legitimate government of the Korean Peninsula. So when South Korea is attacked by North Korea, Harry Truman, the president, this fellow right here, is going to declare a police action. He's not going to declare war. He doesn't ask Congress for permission. He says, hey, it's our duty as a member of the UN to go back up our UN friend here, South Korea, and we are going to go in there and save the day. Because what had happened was in early 1950, the DPRK troops with Russian technology, remember, the Russians aren't fighting us directly, they're fighting through a proxy here. The DPRK troops are going to rush across the 38th parallel and basically take the entirety of the peninsula. The US troops are not particularly well prepared for this, and the Republic of Korea troops, the South Korean troops, are horribly prepared. Throughout the war here, we are going to see that the South Korean troops are treated poorly by their officers are incompetent and corrupt, and basically the US is going to have to carry the entire load because this country can't defend itself. Eventually, the Allied troops are going to be pushed all the way down to basically right here, this little area that my arrow is covering, called Busan. Busan is the last city in Korea that has not been taken by the communists, but luckily, the communists overextend their supply lines. It takes too long for their supplies to get to them from Russia and China, and the US is able to scramble a bunch of UN troops, Australians, British, French, Americans, and send them to Busan under General Douglas MacArthur. You remember him from leading the US troops, the US Army specifically, in the Pacific Theater in the last chapter. Remember, he is a megalomaniac, he's crazy, but he's also a very good general. So the US is able to hold the line and bring in what remains of that small post-war army. Truman is going to reinstitute the draft, bring a ton more people in very, very quickly. And MacArthur is going to start pushing the DPRK, the North Korean troops, back. MacArthur leaves his job as basically rebooting all of Japan. Japan exists as a US ally and is successful today thanks to Douglas MacArthur, who basically forces Japan to adopt a government that is a carbon copy of the United States government. And it works really well over there for him. America, for the most part, loves Douglas MacArthur. They're happy to see him back, and he's happy to talk about being back. So he is going to do something absolutely crazy. He is going to land at a place called Incheon. Incheon is way, way, way up here. It's almost in North Korea, and it is crazy because it has the highest tides in the world. They go up and down about 12 feet during the day, and they leave these massive mud flats that you can sink into up to your hips if you try to walk when the tide is out. So he has a 2-day window to invade or basically America and their South Korean allies are going to be screwed. It works perfectly. The US troops that are there are largely combat veterans from World War II. They're prepared for this, and they rapidly push the North Korean troops back over the 38th parallel, which, remember, is that dividing line between the two countries right there. The US is going to continue to drive the North Korean troops back all the way to the Chinese border on what is called the Yalu River. The Yalu River is up here, and here's where we get into trouble. Because China says if you attack over the Yalu River, or if you attack the bridges on the Yalu River that are owned by both North Korea and the Chinese, China will get involved with this. We don't want to cross there because we don't want to invade communist China. Remember, China fell to the communists after World War II. We could not save China. China, kind of like South Korea, had a very, very bad army that was very corrupt and treated its people poorly. So MacArthur sends his troops right up to the Yalu River, right on the border with China, and China sneaks in. The CIA is not really prepared at this point to have any information, sneaks millions of troops over the borders and basically attacks the US and our UN allies in human wave attacks. And they push the US troops at massive cost of American lives all the way back to, you guessed it, the 38th parallel. So we can see this happening here. Here's your original push down to Pusan. There's the Pusan perimeter. Here's your Incheon landing. This is the US pushing all the way back up to the Yalu River right here. But then we have that North Korean attack, and we're pushed back all the way down here. Eventually, over the next 2 years, we are slowly going to, with our better technology, push the Chinese back to roughly the 38th parallel. This war could have ended earlier, but the Russians and the Chinese were putting a lot of pressure on the North Koreans to not surrender. America is not happy about any of this, and neither is Douglas MacArthur, because Douglas MacArthur says, hey, you know what? Instead of retreating back here in 1951, what we should do is nuke the Chinese. Instead of fighting in this horribly mountainous region that gets up into the 115 degrees in the summer and down to the negative 30s in the winter with all of our troops, we should instead just nuke the Chinese back to the Stone Age. We've got enough of them. Why not nuke them? Harry Truman says to him, hey, how about you don't do that because you don't understand what will happen if we start a war with China. They can keep sending troops over, and then we will lose the entire of the Korean peninsula. Douglas MacArthur says, hey, I don't care that you've served in the military as well. I'm the greatest general who's ever lived, according to himself, not to us. You need to listen to me, and we need to nuke China. And he goes and he starts leaking to the news that the only way to win this war is to nuke China. Harry Truman and now Secretary of Defense George Marshall had retired at the end of Truman's first term, had been retired for about 2 weeks when the Korean War started. He gets a phone call at home, and Harry Truman says, George, you got to come back again. I need you to be my Secretary of Defense. And Marshall says, all right, goes out into the yard, tells his wife that, hey, we can't go on vacation this week like we've planned. I've got to go be the Secretary of Defense now. And now Marshall is able to work with Harry Truman to fire Douglas MacArthur for insubordination, basically saying that he was not supporting the president and therefore he can't be in the job anymore. So thanks to Harry Truman being tired of Douglas MacArthur and George Marshall, again, just being one of my favorite people in American history, fired Douglas MacArthur. MacArthur comes home to the U.S. to massive applause and then decides that, hey, I'm going to run against Harry Truman for the president in a couple of years. So I'm going to testify in front of Congress and show that I'm best suited for this. Instead, he proceeds to absolutely embarrass himself in front of Congress. He shows that he does not have any concept of international relations or what the U.S. budget looks like or how the larger U.S. plans against Russia work. And the entire time, Truman and Marshall basically sit back and just say, okay, see, look, we told you guys. Now, can you please listen to us? Truman is going to appoint a guy named Matthew Ridgway to lead this push that you see right here, these 3 blue arrows. And it is under General Ridgway that we are going to basically reach a stalemate while we negotiate with the North Koreans. Eventually, in 1952, Dwight Eisenhower will win a presidential election. He's going to work with General Ridgway to end the Korean War once and for all, and the border is going to officially be locked at the 38th parallel. So, to summarize the Korean War, U.S. is underprepared after World War II. All of our focus has been on Russia in Europe, not in Asia. Um, the Chinese and the Russians back the North Koreans. The North Koreans attack our allies. With our UN allies, the U.S. attacks back. We almost win. Douglas MacArthur pushes it too far. Douglas MacArthur is fired. George Marshall, Matthew Ridgway, and Harry Truman help to stabilize the war at this green line. And eventually, with the help of Dwight Eisenhower, after Truman's presidency ends, we are going to end the Korean War once and for all. It is a draw, but in the large scheme of things, we consider it a U.S. victory. All right, last stuff to cover for today, and for the week for that matter. Eisenhower abroad. So now that Eisenhower has become president, what is he going to do to follow up on what happened during the Korean War? He is first going to issue what is called, this by the way is Eisenhower with General Ridgway at in Korea, right as the war is about to end. And Eisenhower is going to issue the Eisenhower Doctrine. And it's like a kind of addendum. It's an add-on to the Marshall Plan that says, if you need help stopping communist infiltration into your country, ask. We won't just give you money now, we will also give you military aid. Remember that. We will give you military aid, because in 2 weeks when we talk about the start of the Vietnam War, it is going to be under the Eisenhower Doctrine that the U.S. is going to start to dip its toe into Vietnam. The other big thing that Eisenhower is going to be known for is this concept of massive retaliation. He is going to set this up with his current Secretary of State, Dulles. And massive retaliation says, hey, remember brinksmanship where we bluffed and we said we would take you out? Now, if you mess with us, we will wipe you off the map. If you fire one rocket at us, we will fire a nuke at you. And the idea here is that we are such a massive superpower at this point that America is not to be trifled with. So, hey, don't poke the bull. We will give you the horns, and those horns will have nukes on the end of them. He's also going to just ascribe to something called domino theory. So where containment says we can't let communism expand because it would be bad, domino theory sort of puts more of a face to that and says, if one country falls to the communists, then it's going to spread like a cancer to all of its neighbors. Therefore, we need to use the Eisenhower Doctrine to step in immediately whenever there's a communist threat to make sure that communism does not spread further around the world. For the most part, though, Eisenhower's presidency is going to be peaceful, which is sort of an interesting departure from everything we've seen. The kitchen debate, which I have a picture of down here, is going to happen when Vice President Richard Nixon, you remember him earlier from dealing with Alger Hiss, is going to go visit Russia because Joseph Stalin has died. So what's going to happen here? Our vice president is going to go to a series of informal, quote unquote, televised debates with the new premier of Russia, a guy by the name of Nikita Khrushchev. No, I will never make you spell Nikita Khrushchev. I misspelled Khrushchev 4 times making this slide. Khrushchev's an aggressive guy, but he's willing to talk with the U.S. And the big thing to come out of the kitchen debate is Richard Nixon is able to point out to a lot of Russians who are watching this on TV. Now, granted, it's edited for TV to make the Russians look better, but Nixon is repeatedly able to point out all of the opportunities in America. Everybody gets a refrigerator. Every family has a car. A bunch of the stuff we're going to talk about next week with sort of America after World War II on the home front is all that promise of America, all that promise of capitalism doesn't exist here in Russia, and it would be great if it did because then you could buy blue jeans and McDonald's. It's very effective, and it starts to show that, hey, this is everything America has to offer to the rest of the world. The next two things that are going to happen, that are both pretty important actually, are the first one is a meeting in Geneva. Geneva is the capital of Switzerland, or one of the capitals of Switzerland, and Eisenhower is going to go there and he is going to meet with Premier Khrushchev. And they are going to open up a dialogue. America and Russia are going to start talking regularly again. The last couple of years under Stalin had, like Kennan had said in that long telegram, been so paranoid he didn't even want to talk to America. So Eisenhower is going to open up a new dialogue with the Russians. So there's a little bit of trust there. And that trust is going to expand for good or for ill after what's going to happen in Hungary. There's going to be a massive student-led revolt in Hungary against the communist government that is propped up by the Russians. And the US is going to stay out of it. They are going to say, hey, we don't want to start World War III here, so we are going to let the Russians come in with tanks and kill thousands of their own civilians because we don't want to provoke another war. So by staying out of this brutal Russian crackdown, the US avoids World War III, but also basically concedes that, yes, Eastern Europe will now be under communist control and there's nothing we can do about it. As this is all going on, the space race has started, which we will talk about more next time and the time after that. The space race is the competition between the US and the USSR to succeed in reaching various goals in space. So that could be firing a rocket that breaks out of the atmosphere and then putting something further out into actual space, putting, in one case, a satellite into orbit. The first one happens in 1957. It's called Sputnik, and Russia gets the first satellite in orbit. And America realized it needs to step its game up. They realized this because prior to the mid-1950s, America hadn't really focused on math and science, or really any of your STEM fields. We'd been much more of sort of like, hey, you do whatever you want sort of stuff. And American educational policy is going to change as a result of the space race to look to produce more scientifically minded Americans, which the Soviets had been doing for some time. So America realized it needs to step its game up. This is made all the more clear a couple years later when the Russians send the first man in space, Yuri Gagarin. America will eventually catch up and then surpass the Russians, but the space race is going to go hand in hand with the arms race we talked about a little while ago, because it is going to be more technology development, more business, more spending. And America, as we will see again and again and again, has more money to spend, and they're going to spend it in the right places where the communists don't have a ton of money to spend, and the space race is going to help to bankrupt the Russians and eventually cause the downfall of the Soviet Union in the late 1980s. Two more things to talk about here before we're done for the week. The Cuban Revolution is going to happen in 1959. Fidel Castro is going to overthrow a US-friendly government. Remember, Cuba is only 90 miles off the shore of Florida. Tons of US businesses were based there. If you've ever watched The Godfather Part 2, highly recommended. That has a good chunk to do with the Cuban Revolution. But Fidel Castro is a communist with Russian backing, and now the communists are on America's doorstep, and America is going to get even more and more paranoid about what are the Russians going to do next. And then all of this goodwill that we've built up kind of here with America and the Russians talking again is going to be destroyed by what is called the U-2 incident. And I will wait for that little thing on the bottom to go away. So what happens is the U-2 is a spy plane. It basically looks like a cigar with really long wings. It flies very fast and very high. And what we did was we flew U-2s all over the sky over Russia, and they were too high to be seen or to be shot down, or at least we thought that. Francis Gary Powers is the pilot. He takes off from his base in Pakistan and is going to overfly some southern Russia to see if they're building missile silos for the arms race there, and he is shot down. He does not use the poison capsule, the poison pin that he's given to commit suicide like the spies had expected him to do. He is instead captured, and he is trotted out a couple weeks before Eisenhower and Khrushchev were supposed to meet again to negotiate an arms treaty. And he is trotted out on Russian television and made to admit that he's a spy. Now, everybody knew this was happening, but it's hugely embarrassing for America. This happens in the last couple months of Eisenhower's presidency, and the U.S. relations with Russia that had really been thawing under the entire Eisenhower presidency, so 1952 to 1960, are going to freeze back up again. They're not going to freeze solid like they were under Stalin, but our relationship with the Russians is going to severely slow down after this and lead to some very bad stuff that's going to happen in the 1960s when we get there. So that's it. To summarize Eisenhower, he is more than willing to step in with military force if the communists threaten, but at the same time, he wants to engage in a competition with the Russians that is nonviolent and come to some sort of dialogue with them. It's not all going to work, but some of it's going to work. I also realized about 10 minutes ago, I called this guy Alan Dulles. That's his brother. This is John Foster Dulles, who is the Secretary of State, not Alan Dulles, his brother. Both U.S. statesmen, but this is John Foster Dulles, who's going to help us with massive retaliation. So that's it. Remember, questions go in the comments. Good luck on your little quiz that comes along with this assignment. and hit me up on the office hours if you have questions. Have a good week, folks. Bye.